Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast.
Roland Allen's The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church, Chapter 9, The Way of Spontaneous Expansion. In this chapter, I quote cases in which men have instinctively followed the apostolic practice as far as they could, and I suggest how their work might have been established. I argue that creed and gospel, sacraments and ministry, should be delivered to the whole church rather than to individuals. I then point out how the education of the churches so established might proceed. With regard to long-established, pauperized congregations, I suggest that change will come as they see the example of other unpauperized churches walking in liberty. The rapid and wide expansion of the church in the early centuries was due in the first place mainly to the spontaneous activity of individuals. As I pointed out in my first chapter, a natural instinct to share with others a newfound joy, strengthened and enlightened by the divine grace of Christ, the Savior, inevitably tends to impel men to propagate the gospel. The early church recognized this natural instinct and this divine grace and gave free scope to it. Very many of the Christians in these local churches had no doubt become Christians, led by the spontaneous zeal of someone who was a Christian before them. The names of a few great apostles were known to the whole church, but the first teachers of the majority of the Christians were probably unknown to any but those whom they had quietly influenced. No one, then, was surprised at the spontaneous efforts of individual Christians to convert others to their faith. They probably thought it quite natural. Thus, as men moved about, there were constantly springing up new groups of Christians in different places. The church expanded simply by organizing these little groups as they were converted, handing on to them the organization which she had received from her first founders. It was itself a unity composed of a multitude of little churches, any one of which could propagate itself, and consequently, the reception of any new group of Christians was a very simple matter. By a simple act, the new group was brought into the unity of the church, and equipped, as its predecessors had been equipped, not only with all the spiritual power and authority necessary for its own life as an organized unit, but also with all the authority needed to repeat the same process whenever one of its members might convert men in any new village or town. Thus, the result of the spontaneous labor of any individual Christian were naturally and easily consolidated and established within the unity of the church. This spontaneous activity of the individual, rooted as it is in a universal instinct and in a grace of the Holy Spirit given to all Christians, is not peculiar to any one age or race. We are familiar with it today. It constantly shows itself, and it would repeat the history of the early church, if it were not that our fears have set up barriers in the way of its proper fruition, as I have attempted to show in earlier chapters. What we see today is the spontaneous zeal of Christians attempting to repeat, so far as they can, the early history of the Christian church. The only reason why such spontaneous activity on the part of our converts has not resulted in the foundation of churches is because our bishops have treated them in a very different way from that in which the bishops of the early centuries treated those who did precisely the same work. They equipped them and set them free. We have refused to equip them and have bound them to the foreign organization of our mission. Thus, we have cast down the men whose spontaneous zeal led them to convert their neighbors and friends by setting over them our trained and paid lay catechists. Thus, we have discouraged any others who might have followed their example. We have looked upon such spontaneous activity as something strange and wonderful. When we find an example of it told in our missionary magazines, we generally find it associated with notes of exclamation and expressions of astonishment or anxiety. We have not known how to expect it. We have not known how to deal with it, and consequently, it is not unnaturally more rare than it ought to be. Still, it remains so essential, the natural action of that instinct to impart a joy and the gift of the Holy Spirit, who is the Spirit which desires and strives after the salvation of men, that in spite of our discouragement, it constantly breaks out afresh. I have already had occasion to refer to some examples. I will here only cite two more as typical of a larger number. 1. An African priest in charge of the mission at Tarqua on the Gold Coast gives the following account of one of his experiences. I was called to visit some Christians at a village 163 miles from my station. When I arrived, I met about 100 converts waiting for baptism. A young man from one of our stations, who has no teacher, had managed to learn and read a little of the New Testament and the prayer book in Fanti. He went up to his village, where some of his relations lived, early in 1920. There he started teaching his own people, and the good news spread. They built a little church, and for a year he labored hard, teaching them as much as he could every morning before they went to their farms, and in the evening before they retired to rest. When he thought that they were ready for baptism, he heard of our scarcity of clergy and encouraged them to wait. After careful examination on my arrival, I baptized 45 adults. 2. Last month, I had the Reverend Fong Hao Kong here for 3 weeks to assist me by visiting some of my Chinese congregations. I sent him to Taran, about 22 miles from here, where there was a congregation that had never been visited by a clergyman since its settlement in the country. I had received an invitation to go to them, but I thought it better to send Mr. Fong, as I have no knowledge of Chinese. He found a congregation of over 40 Christians who had come from China nearly 10 years ago and settled as gardeners. They had elected as their teacher and reader one of their party, a man named Chang Shu Chung. He had in his early days been a teacher of a heathen school, but was converted to Christianity, and subsequently became a teacher in a mission school at Fuchao. At first the community subscribed to pay a salary to their teacher, but later they were not so prosperous, and the salary ceased. Chang Shu Chung has, however, gone on with his work without any pay, and Sunday after Sunday has not failed to assemble the people for worship in the little church which they built for themselves. On the Sunday that Mr. Fong spent with them, he had a congregation of over 40, and administered Holy Communion to 14, and baptism to 1 adult and 11 infants. This was the first occasion since they left China that they had been visited by a priest or had an opportunity of receiving the sacraments. We see in both these cases a spontaneous expansion of the church, so far as these people were able. We see what might have been churches founded without any assistance or direction from the foreign missionaries. These people were self-supporting. They received no grants of any description from any society. They were able to supply all their own needs. They had built their own churches, and they maintained their own services. Their leader was exercising what in an earlier age would have been called a charismatic ministry. They were self-governing, directing all the affairs of their own church. All that was needed for their establishment was that their leaders should have been ordained, for in both cases they had evidently been taught, or at any rate, had somehow learned, that only ordained men could baptize or administer the Lord's Supper. If this difficulty had been removed by ordination, then in each case we should have seen at once the creation of a new church on truly apostolic lines, and the example so set would certainly have encouraged and inspired other native Christians to have followed the example set them. Churches so founded would have been unquestionably native churches. The least intelligent native looking at them must at once have perceived that there was something which it needed no foreigner to maintain. They would have been native churches in a very different sense from those pseudo-national native churches which we talk about creating. Such churches would bring new life into the mission field and open all the doors closed to us. The existence of one prophesies the conversion of the country. As I said before, these cases are not rare. Almost every country in the world can show similar examples, and in some parts of the world they are quite common. The Bishop of Lagos, for instance, has told us that in southern Nigeria the greatest progress of recent years has been due not so much to the direct work of the European missionaries or of paid African teachers, as to the spontaneous work of untrained and unpaid native Christians. I believe the time is ripe for this advance. I have already tried to show that our present missions are not the natural homes of spontaneous expansion, but the societies themselves are doing something to prepare the way. They are now tending to concentrate more and more upon medical, educational, and social work carried on in institutions. And as they do that, their resources in men and money will be so fully occupied that they must inevitably withdraw more and more from direct evangelistic work, and look upon this work as the proper work of native Christians. And many of our evangelistic missionaries are certainly looking in this direction. There is, therefore, a good hope that a movement towards spontaneous expansion may arrive at a propitious moment. Let us suppose, then, that a missionary hears of such a case as one of those which I have quoted, or himself by his preaching has prepared a small body of men for baptism. Let us suppose that some of them have been baptized. We must realize that baptized Christians have rights. What are those rights? They have a right to live as Christians in an organized Christian church where the sacraments of Christ are observed. They have a right to obey Christ's commands and to receive His grace. In other words, they have a right to be properly organized with their own proper ministers. They have a right to be a church, and not a mere congregation. These are the inalienable rights of Christians, and we cannot baptize people and then deny their rights or deprive them of them. When we baptize, we take responsibility for seeing that those whom we baptize can so live in the church. What then ought the missionary to do? If he has baptized the first converts, we may take it for granted that he has assured himself that they are in the faith, and he ought then to invite the bishop to act towards them as the apostles and their immediate followers acted in like case. The little group must be fully equipped with spiritual power and authority, and the bishop ought to deliver to them the creed, the gospel, the sacraments, and the ministry by solemn and deliberate act. It is to do that work that we have missionary bishops. The bishop must deliver to them what St. Paul called the tradition, of which the Apostles' Creed is the later expression, that they may have a standard by which to try all that they may hear later. The Creed is a touchstone. It is by that they will know whether any teaching they may hear is to be received or to be rejected. It does not follow that every member of that little church must know by heart a form of words as long as the Apostles' Creed, but it does follow that when each has heard it, and it may be expressed in very simple language so that the most ignorant can really hear it, he must be prepared to say, that I believe, that is my belief. It is in this sense that the creed is to be delivered to the church. Thereafter, it is theirs. It belongs to them as much as it belongs to us. The bishop must deliver to them the gospel, that they may know where to turn for instruction. For they must learn from the very beginning to rely upon God, not upon men, for spiritual progress, upon the Bible, not upon human teachers for spiritual instruction. Here again, when he delivers the Bible to the church, it does not follow that every member in the congregation must be able to read it, but it does follow that all the Christians must learn to revere it and to know it. Consequently, in such churches, every possible mark of honor should be attached to the power to read and explain the Bible. Double honor to those who labor in the word and doctrine. The priest in such a church is not necessarily the preacher. The Bible is read by those best able to read it and expound it, but no man's mouth should be closed, and the most illiterate will sometimes be found able to make a comment of the most profound spiritual significance because it is rooted in his experience. A writer is quoted in the International Review of Missions for October 1920 as saying, "A village panchayat may be an assembly of illiterate men, but it is not an assembly of ignorant men by any means, nor are they men uneducated in matters of government. Indian villagers, even parish villagers, have had centuries of education in matters of government and administration. It is often because our missionaries do not know enough of the vernacular really to follow an Indian palaver that they fail to discover how much sound sense and clear reasoning and practical wisdom there is in it. And the same truth applies to the church. Illiterate members often bring to the church a profound spiritual knowledge and a sense of the practical application of Christian truth to daily life, which is hidden from the accomplished student. This, then, is what I mean by the delivery of the gospel to the church. The Bible is delivered to the whole church as the message of God to the whole church. Thenceforward, it belongs to them and is in their care. It is theirs as much as it is ours. The sacraments must be delivered to the church. The bishop must make sure that they have learnt the manner and the meaning of their observance. They must be taught how to administer them and how to receive them practically. They must not be allowed to think, as some of them may have gathered from their observation of a mission station, that baptism is the end of a long probation during which a man has proved his capacity to observe Christian laws. But they must think of it as the beginning of a Christian life which a man cannot live without God's grace. They must be taught how to administer it, and if necessary, they must be warned of the grave dangers which may ensue if they abuse its use, dangers from which the whole congregation and the whole Christian church may suffer. They must be taught how to administer the Holy Communion and how to receive it, and that in a very practical way. They must be taught the meaning of the Holy Communion, and here I am very bold. I have a profound belief in the power of the sacraments. I believe that in a divine way the use of them teaches the teachable their inward meaning, so that the church grows by degrees into a deeper and deeper sense of the divine grace imparted to them. And therefore, I think that we need to be in no hurry to attempt to teach new converts all that we think we know about them. I think it suffices if we begin with some one aspect of the Holy Communion, and that the one which our converts can most easily apprehend, whether the common meal at which Christ is the host, or the common sacrifice which all offer together, or the common thanksgiving for the common salvation through the death of Christ. If they learn one of these in its simplest form, they can learn the others by degrees. Much they will learn without any teaching from others, by their reading of the Bible in common, much from participation. For in the common rite they will find in experience a common bond between Christian, and of all with Christ. And by degrees they will discover the profound significance of such communion with one another and with Christ. Thus the first teaching need not be long or difficult of apprehension. This is what I mean by the delivery of the sacraments of the Church. They should be delivered to the Church as a whole, and the Church as a whole should be responsible for their proper observance. When the Corinthians misused the Lord's Supper, St. Paul rebuked the whole Church. Ministers must be ordained that the Church may have a Christian government and officers to direct the proper conduct of the Church in the due administration of her rights. The selection of these officers should not be difficult. St. Paul in the pastoral epistles has laid down, very clearly, rules to guide a bishop in the selection of such officers. They were to be, he said, men of good moral character, free from the besetting vices of their people, men of experience and weight, men held in the highest respect by the members of the Church and their heathen neighbors, men who knew the tradition and could uphold it, men who could maintain order by their moral superiority. In fact, the men whom any decent society would naturally choose for its leaders. To these men must be delivered the authority to administer the sacraments and to guide and govern the Church in its religious services and its daily social life. No question of pay should be raised or considered. St. Paul did not raise it. We need not. But here again, it is the Church as a whole which receives officers, not officers which receive a church. Ministers should be given to a church, not a church to a minister. And the Church as a whole should be responsible for the good conduct of its officers, just as the officers are responsible for the good conduct of the Church. When a member of the Church at Corinth committed a moral offense, St. Paul did not rebuke the elders of the Church only, he rebuked the Church as a whole. A church thus constituted is a real church in the apostolic sense of the word. There is one other point which I think the bishop should impress upon the Church if he is seeking for spontaneous expansion. It is not that he should exhort them to take the gospel to their neighbors, but that he should tell them what to do when they have made converts in their neighborhood too remote to be intimately attached to their own body, or in case people from neighboring villages came to them to learn the Christian faith. He should tell them first to make sure that the new converts are really converts to the faith of Christ, and understand the use of the creed, the gospels, the sacraments, and the ministry, and then to send word to the bishop. Having done this, the missionary and the bishop should leave that newly constituted church to find out for itself what being a church means in daily practice, to find out that it can do things as a church. When I say that he must leave such a church to find out for itself what a church is, I do not mean that he should neglect it, for he ought to take thought for its education. We must learn the distinction between leaving Christians to learn what they can only learn for themselves and abandoning them. It is a distinction which we find it hard to make. It is a lesson which we find it hard to learn. The moment anyone suggests leaving new converts to find out for themselves by their experience without the guidance of a foreign missionary how to manage the simple affairs of a simple village, instantly the father, mother, elder brother, directing, spirit of the energetic missionary rises in revolt and cries, "You cannot abandon them so early to their own devices. To leave newborn churches to learn by experience is apostolic. To abandon them is not apostolic. To watch over them is apostolic. To be always nursing them is not apostolic. To guide their education is apostolic. To provide it for them is not apostolic. The missionary and the bishop must watch over their education." Instantly we perceive that the education of which we are speaking is something very different from what is commonly called missionary education. Missionary education, commonly so called, is a thing of schools and colleges, and for the few. The education of which we are now speaking is the education of the church, and embraces the whole Christian community. The education of which we are speaking is education in the church, of the church, and by the church. It is essentially religious education, not in the sense in which we talk of religious education in schools, where religious education means instruction in the subject matter of the religion, given by a teacher for an hour in a day, which is devoted mainly to secular education, but in a very different sense. This is an education in the management and direction of the Christian church as a body, and of the family as a Christian family. The religious life is the one subject, and there is no other. The one thing to be learned is how to live the Christian life in that state and social order in which the Christians find themselves. It is an education which Europeans cannot conduct, because few, if any Europeans, can ever really understand the position of new converts from heathenism. They cannot look at the position from the inside, and it can only be the fruit of an internal growth. But if they cannot conduct it, they can watch over it, and they can assist it, as well as retard it. The education of the church is rather to be compared to the education of an infant in the use of its faculties, than to the education of a boy in Latin grammar. A good master can teach a boy Latin grammar. It is in a very different sense that a mother teaches a child to walk, or to see and to observe. Nature will teach the majority of children to walk, if they are allowed the use of their limbs. So the church learns the use of its faculties if it is allowed the use of its faculties. The man, then, who would guide such a church, as I have described, and assist its education, must obviously get out of the way to give it room, because if he stays, or if he leaves someone from outside in charge, it will plainly not have room to move. But he must watch over it, and warn it by instruction when it is in danger of going seriously astray, or falling heavily. The exact point at which such warning is necessary is a question of the most intimate delicacy, and it can only be solved by the instinct and insight of the educator with a watchful eye. It is impossible for anyone else to judge or to lay down any rule beforehand. This practical education of the church I have put first, because it is the most important and the most fundamental education. The church must learn to use its faculties, and it can only do that by using them. In doing this, it will by itself both reveal and train the leaders of the future. By exercising government in the small body, the real leaders of the church learn to govern and direct the church composed of many such little churches. By teaching in the small body, they learn to instruct a church composed of many such churches. By active evangelistic work in their own neighborhood, they learn to lead a mission in a whole province. I said that the education was wholly religious. It is an education in how to apply Christian faith to life under the conditions in which the Christians live. That is the one thing which matters, and that cannot be learnt in a school, but only in the world of life. Nevertheless, there are certain aids which do materially assist the student of that art. I said that the one thing needful was to learn to apply the Christian faith to life, and obviously, to that end, the study of the Bible is all important. When I spoke of the church, I took it for granted that at least one member of the congregation could read the Bible, and that there was a Bible, or at least a gospel, in their language. That is not perhaps absolutely necessary, for the tradition might be handed down orally, and a church might make immense progress, though all its members were illiterate. Nevertheless, it is obvious that knowledge of the Bible is of great importance. Generally speaking, it is true that most of those earnest Christians who have spontaneously taught their friends and neighbors have received some instruction, have learned to read, and can therefore teach someone else to read. But if we suppose an absolutely illiterate community, we should all agree that a man watchful of the education of the churches would desire that they should be able to have a Bible read to them, and would take steps to secure this as far as he could. There are two ways in which that can be done. For I exclude, of course, the sending of a paid missions teacher to live in the place and to do for the church everything that it ought to do for itself. The church can either invite someone who is able to read to teach a few of its own members to read, or it can send one or two of its members, or some of its members can go of their own free motion, to learn this art elsewhere. Neither of these courses is difficult, provided that the Christians have learned what is the place of the Bible in the church. If they have learned to pay it due honor, they will respect and admire those who have knowledge of it, and out of it can show them larger and truer conceptions of Christian doctrine. There is no need to insist upon this. Muslims travel from Nigeria to Cairo to learn that Quran. Men universally respect the man who possesses in larger measure than they do themselves knowledge of a subject which they feel to be of vital importance, and no one need have any anxiety that this rule will not apply. From the point of view of spontaneous expansion, we have no need to think of secular education, as we call it, at all, nor to make any provision for it. It is quite certain that men who learn to read religiously for a strictly religious purpose would certainly in some cases begin to desire and to win for themselves and their children further education in what we call secular subjects. If there were no mission schools, they would still do it. By using government schools, if there were any such, and if there were none, they would in time create schools for themselves. Given an opportunity at all, it is quite certain that intellectual enlightenment would increase in a church which has the home of religious teaching. And such enlightenment, beginning in spiritual illumination, would be well founded, and the church would remain always a fountain of enlightenment. The whole church would grow together in enlightenment, as each member brought in a new contribution, and each generation made some advance. To us, progress might seem slow, but all true educationalists know well the importance of slow growth for solid progress, even in the education of the individual. And when we are dealing with the education of a community, we are thinking in terms not of years, but of generations. We must learn not to despise slow growth. The one thing of importance is that there should be some growth, some progress, however slight it may be in the eyes of the casual observer. This, then, is what I mean by watching over the education of the church. To some minds this may seem inadequate, and they may think that we should make better progress by exercising direct control and forcing the peace. But I hope I have given reason to think that this is not really true. When we consider that we are building for the centuries, and at any rate, I hope that no one will now accuse me of advocating the abandonment of our converts to their own devices, for surely all that I have been saying is the direct opposite of abandonment. To watch and to assist spontaneous progress is certainly not to abandon converts to their own devices. The question may be asked, for it is nearly always the first question asked, when any reform is proposed. How would you apply that to congregations which have learned from the very beginning to rely upon foreign support and guidance? Now it is plain that to ordain simple unpaid villagers and to constitute a church among them is quite a different thing from ordaining paid and trained missions agents. There are, among these paid agents, men who, because they really have become a trusted leader of their people, would continue to lead them, if they and the people whom they led were free. But in many cases, if the people were free to choose, and the paid catechists had not the support of the foreigners behind them, the leaders whom we set to lead would not lead for another day. If we removed the pay and the support of our authority, the Christians would revert tomorrow to the guidance of their old and experienced fathers, and leave these trained native agents on one side. With such material, it is impossible to constitute the church. It is a sad thing, but it is nevertheless true, that if we talk of establishing the local church, the very men who have trained leaders for the native church cry out that those men whom they have trained are not fit for this purpose. Neither these foreign teachers, nor these native teachers, nor the congregations led and directed by them, are prepared. Here and there, the bishop might find cases in which it would be possible to constitute the church at once, and perhaps those cases are really more numerous than I imagine. But however that may be, I myself look for the salvation of these pauperized communities rather through the influence which the sight of young churches advancing spontaneously in the freedom of the gospel will exercise upon them, than by any direct action or exhortation on our part. Because I am sure that properly constituted churches would expand as they felt and knew their power. The way to convert the older missions is to show them what spontaneous expansion means in practice. As I have said, spontaneous expansion is spontaneous. It is not created by exhortation. It springs up unbidden. Where men see it, they covet it, and when the converts of the older missions see it, they will begin to desire it. Desiring it, they will begin to seek it, and seeking it, to express it. Meanwhile, they continue as they are. The missionary of spontaneous expansion need not be over-anxious about them. He need not hasten to convert them. He can leave them to their present foreign leaden with perfect confidence, assured that they too will awaken when the time is right. He will not lack room for his work because of their existence, for they never have, never will, occupy all the land. But someone may say, the expansion of the early church was, according to your own statement, due in large measure to the fact that in the early church bishops were consecrated for the new churches who could in their turn consecrate others for any new churches which might spring up in their neighborhood. But you asked for no more than the ordination of priests in the village churches, and they could not ordain priests for churches which might spring up in their neighborhood. If you want to return to the practice of the early church, why do you not have the courage of your opinions and ask that bishops should be again consecrated for the village and town churches, so that they might be able to propagate their like? If you did that, you would be consistent, and the native spontaneous expansion which you desire would become possible. But by your hesitation, that you establish indeed village churches, yet you leave those churches unequipped to propagate themselves unless they can obtain the assistance of a bishop who is probably a foreigner. What answer can I give to that? I am indeed sure that to consecrate native village bishops is the true way of expansion. I believe that it would be far safer for the present bishop of Honan or Southern Rhodesia, for instance, to establish 100 or 200 unpaid native bishops, not assistant bishops, but diocesan bishops, ruling over small dioceses consisting of a village or a group of villages, because in ruling such dioceses, men would learn the meaning of episcopal authority in its simplest form, and so be prepared to occupy the position of metropolitans as the churches grew in numbers. But if, as Father Kelly said, the idea of a strictly local ministry, unprofessional, untrained, and unpaid, seems to be inconceivable, much more does the idea of a local episcopate, unprofessional, untrained, and unpaid, seem inconceivable. It is possible that a bishop might be found to ordain local, unpaid presbyters. That bishops should be found to consecrate local, unpaid bishops seems incredible. I may deplore it, but so it is. To ordain only presbyters for the local churches would not be the best, nor the wisest, nor the safest course, but it would be something. It would be a move in the right direction, and it would, I believe, prepare the way for a native episcopate. The spontaneous expansion of the church, reduced to its elements, is a very simple thing. It asks for no elaborate organization, no large finances, no great numbers of paid missionaries. In its beginning, it may be the work of one man, and that a man neither learned in the things of this world, nor rich in the wealth of this world. The organization of a little church on the apostolic model is also extremely simple, and the most illiterate converts can use it, and the poorest are sufficiently wealthy to maintain it. Only as it grows and spreads through large provinces and countries do any complex questions arise, and they arise only as a church composed of many little churches is able to produce leaders prepared to handle them by experience, learned in the smaller things. There's no need at the beginning to talk of preparing leaders to face great national issues. By the time the issues have become great and complex, the leaders of the little churches of today will have learned their lesson, as they cannot possibly be taught it beforehand. No one, then, who feels within himself the call of Christ to embark on such a path as this need say, I am too ignorant, I am too inexperienced, I have too little influence, or I have not sufficient resources, The first apostles of Christ were, in the eyes of the world, unlearned and ignorant men. It was not until the church had endured a persecution and had grown largely in numbers that Christ called a learned man to be his apostle. The missionaries who spread the gospel and established the church throughout the lands round the Mediterranean are not known to us as men of great learning or ability. Most of them are not known by name at all. Only when the church had been established and had spread widely did Christ call the great doctors whose names are familiar to us by their writings, or by their great powers of organization and government. What is necessary is faith. What is needed is the kind of faith which, uniting a man to Christ, sets him on fire. Such a man can believe that others, finding Christ, will be set on fire also. Such a man can see that there is no need of money to fill a continent with the knowledge of Christ. Such a man can see that all that is required to consolidate and establish that expansion is the simple application of the simple organization of the church. It is to men who know the faith, who see that vision, that I appeal. Let them judge what I have written. All right, that brings us to the end of Alan's work here. Now, if you made it all this way, you're probably Anglican, and if you're not, congratulations, because there is definitely a lot of dead time in here to an extent, boring time, maybe you'd say, because using maybe more archaic examples, from 100 years ago, 150 years ago that don't apply to us as much, or that seem a little bit more foreign to us, or specific to maybe the history of the Anglican Church. Okay, I totally get that. But the application for Christians in particular is just, it's very profound. And especially, like I said, earlier, several times throughout this season, is coming on the heels of Bernard Eller's work about the complexity of the church, the institutionalization, and in our season on simplicity in general, which is where this work is placed. And if you noticed, if you have a chance to follow the link and go read this, you just scroll to the very last page. Look at the very last page. It's like half a page long. It's like 3 paragraphs. And how many times does he say simple and simplicity and all that in just the last couple of paragraphs? A bunch, quite a lot. Because a lot of this, a lot of the stuff that Alan identifies as being problematic with how we're doing things, it centers around complexity, right? Or complexification, as we discussed in our early on in our simplicity season. It's this tendency we have when we desire control, power, when we have fears, right? Fears of losing control, fears of losing power, all that tends to produce complexity, right? Think about all the things that are complex in our lives. The washing machine example is what I used in the season. But washing machine is actually, it makes your life very simple when it's working well, but it's extremely complex. It only takes one small part to go out, and you've got some big problems in terms of not being able to do laundry, which is a big problem for us today, right? That would be a big first world problem. It'd be something that you'd probably feel like you needed to resolve within the week, if not sooner. But what does that do? The washing machine gives us control over our lives in a huge way. I don't have to walk down to the river to wash my clothes. I don't have to be smelly. I don't have to be unhygienic, right? I don't have to risk diseases and things because I don't wash my clothes. I don't have to spend 5 hours a day with a washboard washing my clothes by hand. There's a lot that the washing machine allows us to do because of its complexity. It gives me so much more control over my life and how I spend my time. And it also gives me, in some ways then, it gives me more power, because time is money and money is power. With the time that I save, I'm able to do a whole lot more and exercise more dominion over the world in some ways. Now, that doesn't mean that technology or complexity is inherently problematic, but we are a people who who are not satisfied with the amount of control we have now. Most of the time, humans are seeking more and more and more control. And so we need prophetic voices like Alan who call us to simplify where we can and when we can. Right? There's a huge importance to simplifying things. Now, Eller is very much into the dialectic approach. And so he will argue for simplicity, but then he's like, well, but wait, right? And he lists all these simplicity movements that really aren't good at heart, right? A lot of ways that we do seek to simplify things that really are just fads and other sorts of things that are complex in their own ways or misguided. So we don't simplify for the sake of simplification, but complexity harbors a lot of problems. So in this final chapter, Alan is going to just take a look at some specific ways that he would recommend guiding a church if somebody was a missionary. And really it's let the church be the church, right? Let people do their thing. So if Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and if he loves people and people love him and become passionate about him, which if the product's good, they're going to want it, right? And if the price is right, they're going to want it. So if they recognize their sin and their need for Jesus and the fact that God loves them and all that other stuff, okay, they're going to be passionate about him. They're going to make some mistakes, but kind of with Alan's analogy, you got to let the child walk in order to walk, because if you don't let him walk on his own legs, he's never going to learn to walk. He's going to crawl his whole life. So let the church be the church and just provide them with a little bit of scaffolding so that if they err too much, like if a child starts to walk and wobble and he's not sure on his feet and he's walking towards the edge of something steep or walking towards a road, okay, then you stop him, right? But a lot of what Alan argues is just let him go and provide the sacraments and things for them. If they're really the church, and these things like baptism and communion and all that are really graces and mercies of God, and they're really substantive in some way, whatever way you think that is, then why are we making things so complex and like only if some bishop from, who can trace his apostolic lineage all the way back to St. Paul comes, and only then can they have the bread administered to them. And that's something I've sort of had problems with my church about. Like I get a lot of churches. I wouldn't just say conservative evangelical. I don't know how the Catholics would treat it, or Orthodox. But there's a whole big thing about like apostolic succession. Like only certain people who are ordained and whatnot can administer communion. And I just like I would like to know, number one, because my church is very big about like inerrancy and all that other stuff. And it's like, well, it's sola scriptura, right? It has to come from the Bible. And like, where does that come from in the Bible that like only the pastors can administer communion? And so I really struggle with certain ideas. Like tradition is very important. I think that we should look at the Bible and church tradition. But at the same time, just because you can find something in 300 AD that the early church is doing doesn't mean that they were right about it. And even if they were generally right about something, are they right about it in all situations, or are there not any context-dependent things? So there's a lot that I could talk about there. I know I've mentioned communion before, and the Eucharist, and the vision that we get of it in, I think, Corinthians, where it sure looks like they're hanging out and having meals together with the rich and the poor, and they're eating and communing, versus like walking up front and getting a bread and feeling bad about yourself for a little bit and repenting so that you can eat the bread and drink the wine. It feels like we've made the focus very individualistic and not communal, and we're not really getting together. We're just kind of doing our own thing. So there's a lot about communion and having like the paid officiant be the one who could administer it as if like that person has something special about them that allows the bread and the wine to become something special, as opposed to a body of believers, more like Eller kind of puts forward. I don't know. I'm rambling at this point because it's too long of a discussion, and I'm trying to pack it in here, and it's stuff that I haven't really super formulated ideas on and hashed out. So sorry about that. Anyway, you get the point from Alan, and I'm just going to leave it there before I ramble anymore. I hope you enjoyed the season, and next week we start a new one. So hope to have you back then.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.